Thank you very much for joining me today. Um, if you don't mind, first, will you introduce yourself to our audience a little bit?
Well, I'm Alma Katsu. I'm a novelist. I have five published novels. This is the most recent one. I hope you don't mind my shameless plug.
Absolutely do.
Um, Thank you. And my sixth novel will be coming out in the spring, where I'm trying something completely different. I'm writing a spy novel, and we can talk about why that came about. But most of my books, like The Deep and the one that I'm probably most known for, The Hunger, are sort of reimaginings of real historical events with a little horror twist.
Awesome. I am familiar with your latest two books. I have copies of both of them. I'm making my way through Hunger right now. Um, so, how many books did you write before you finally got published? Do you have like a drawer full of older drafts that you've tucked away, or?
I think I threw all of them out because they were so embarrassing. So if I had a really weird career, this will be heartening for the folks who are watching, who are coming to this a little later or coming back to it. That's what I did. I started out when I was very young. I wanted to be a novelist, but I'm older than dirt. So this was pre-internet, and nobody knew how to do this. Especially, I grew up in a nice area, but very, you just didn't know, right? You didn't know a lot of authors and that sort of thing. So I actually I wrote in my 20s, but I stopped, and we can get into why that happened. And I didn't get back to it until I was 40. And then it took 10 years to write the book that ended up being my first novel. And I didn't expect it to be published ever, but I just couldn't give up on it. So I kept rewriting it and rewriting it over 10 years. And I mean, like, writing every day for hours. Now, it wasn't the only thing I worked on, but I think that kind of shows maybe what you have to go through in order to get that first book published, because none of us know what we're doing for the first book. And so I sold it at 50. I was 50 years old when I sold my first book. And I've managed to claw and hang on to my little place in the business for 10 years. So I'm pretty happy with that.
That's so awesome. So, in the book that actually was published, the one that you said you worked on for 10 years, that was The Taker, right?
Yes. Yes, it
Is
was.
is that the book that got you an agent?
Yes. Well, I guess the thing with agents is, in this day and age, it's important just to know what you want, right? Because writers do have options. You can self-publish. There's there's probably more small presses now. And you don't need an agent for all of it. Obviously, if you're self-published, you don't need an agent. So it really just comes down to what your goals are. And the one thing I would say is to not shortchange yourself. Because I do meet a lot of people who, I think they get very anxious about the whole agenting process, and they take themselves out of the game maybe. But if your goal is to be published by a big five, one of the big five publishers, and that's what you want, yeah, you got to go through the pain like the rest of us. But and you become a better writer for it, all the rewriting and that sort of thing. But yeah, you do need an agent.
Yeah.
So, like most people, I submitted too early. I mean, we all do, because you don't know what to expect. You don't know really if what you've written is good enough or where the flaws are. You may have a critique group, which is absolutely, I think it's a great thing to go through. Early on in that, at 40, when I decided to go back to writing, I also decided to go into an MA program. So it was a part-time, wasn't an MFA program, but it was a part-time master's program in writing at Hopkins. It was a Hopkins program, so
Oh,
John
cool.
Hopkins University, very well regarded program. And so you do go through critique classes. You have to take three critique classes in it. So even that, though, you don't know if the advice you're getting is right, or should you go in that direction. And sometimes really the best feedback you can get is through agents. And so we all get turned down a lot. But after 10 years, um, so if anyone's read The Taker, they know it's a pretty complex book, and it was really hard book for a first time, for a debut novelist to tackle. But of course, I didn't know that at the time either. Um, but by the time I got it to the point where, okay, I really think I know it's not perfect, but I think it's ready. I did my research. I only submitted to two agents, and they both wanted to represent it. So the main thing I learned, and people hate this advice, but it's true. If you write a book, that's like undeniable, you'll get an agent and you'll get published. The trick is to write that book. But what most people, I think, end up doing is they write a book and they think it's good enough, right? But when you're a debut, good enough is not good enough. It has to knock people's socks off. And then it won't be a problem. Everyone's going to represent you, and many publishing houses will want to publish your book. I went to auction, as a matter of fact. That first book went to auction.
That's awesome.
Yeah, very lucky, but 10 years. Yeah.
I love the story of like the overnight success, because every author that like their like fifth book blows up and suddenly they're an
Yeah.
overnight success, but they've been writing for like 10 or 20 years. Um,
Yeah. I'm still waiting to be that overnight success. I've been really lucky. I'm close, but I'm not on the New York Times bestseller list.
does writing, whenever you're writing, does writing exhaust you or does it energize you? When you're done with a big day of writing, how do you feel?
Good, I would say. It doesn't really exhaust me. Boy, that's such a complex subject, isn't it? I'm lucky in being older. I've had a whole career in government work, extremely demanding career. We can get into that. I was in the intelligence business for 35 years, and it really, that's when I went back to writing at 40. It was because I realized now I know how hard you have to work to really be successful, to be on the top of your game, no matter what field it is. And I could honestly say I wasn't there in my 20s, which was when I kind of stopped writing. And so I was ready to give it a try. I wasn't, I wanted to get published, or I expected to get published because the odds are so high. But I just wanted to write a good book. I wanted to learn what it took to write a book. And there was like, I really wanted to write a book with big characters that were unforgettable, right? That was my modest goal.
Mhm.
What a crazy person I was. But that was, that was my goal. And, to this day, I still love writing, but what I get more out of it, I think, is just the challenge
Mhm.
of, trying to get the next rung up, trying to be a better writer, trying to be a better storyteller, trying to find out, a better way to tell the story. I mean, one of the hardest things, we all have ideas in our heads, but one of the hardest things is figuring out that complex way to tell that story. It's not always like a linear thing, right? That if you juggle things around a little bit, that maybe that book is really going to go, it's going to pop.
Mhm.
Instead of being an ordinary book, it's going to be that extraordinary book that just sucks people in. And that challenge of still trying to do that every day. That's what I enjoy.
All the best writers that I've seen have that same mentality. That sort of it's not just about like writing and publishing, but about like leveling up. Each book is
Yeah.
like trying to top the last one. Um, so your novel, The Hunger, is I think you mentioned at the beginning. It's a reimagining of the Donner Party, but with a supernatural horror twist. And the adaptation rights were acquired by, from what I read, Ridley Scott's production company. And so I have to
Yes.
ask, how will this movie fit into the Alien cinematic universe? Can we expect Ripley in the first one, or is she going to be in one of the sequels?
Wouldn't that be awesome? That would be awesome. That the film rights going to Ridley Scott's company was the first time I'd ever sold, no, not sold, optioned film rights, and that's the important thing. So, and it just got caught up in development hell and just hung around there for a while, but we have the rights back.
Cool.
Ironically, I just talked to a producer today who's very interested in them. But that's the thing when it comes to movie and TV and stuff. It's so up and down, and so things just drag on forever, and it's kind of crazy. But why do we want it? Because it helps broaden your audience. So many more people will hear about your book if you can get them. It's just something. What's the word I'm looking for? I don't like it, but there it is. Like if you can get a movie or a book out, chances are you can open up your audience. I wish audiences were bigger for just books, but
How hard was it to, whenever you were optioned, how hard was it to sort of sit on that news? How long were you able to talk about it, or did you kind of have to keep it quiet until they announced it?
that was a weird one because it broke really fast. As a matter of fact, the film rights were optioned before I even had a book deal.
Oh, wow.
I know. It was like just a couple months, and we were already well on the road with the publisher, but when they heard that, I think because the Hunger actually was preempted.
Wow.
It preempted, publisher offered us enough money to take it off the table, which is was also a first for me. So I mean, that's the magic of the film deal. So yeah, it's just good all around. I think it got a lot of early interest in the book, and as I'm sure you know, we've been very very lucky with The Hunger. It's won international awards. It's yeah, it's just done great. It did not hit the New York Times bestseller list, but it got us just about everything else, I
That's
think.
about that because you said that there was the hunger was preempted. It was bought
Mhm.
before you had a book deal. So I read on Sci-Fi Wire, and I want to make sure that I say this right because I don't want to get the facts wrong. But on this interview with you on Sci-Fi Wire, they said that the book The Hunger, the concept was pitched, I think, to you and your agent by Glasstown Entertainment.
Yes, yes. So these are partner deals. And, you know, I wasn't aware of this before. There's this whole panoply, right, of different ways that books get published. And I do think more and more these days, publishers are under a lot of pressure to deliver big hits.
Mm-hmm.
And so a lot of times, um, you know, it helps to have this packaging deal, you know, where you have a movie deal or a video game deal or, you know, a graphic novel or something that's a tie in, depending on what the book is. And a lot of times it's work for hire, you know, where you're like novelizations. Usually you're just paid a lump sum to write a book or something. But the company came to my agent and asked if I would be interested in writing it, and I would be their first adult fiction title. And I was interested because I know the two women who run that company, and they're both best selling YA authors, and they were both editors for Penguin a long time ago.
Oh wow.
And so I was like, you know, writing is a very lonely business. And most of the time, you don't get to compare really work deep closely with another novelist, right? I mean, some people will partner for a book or something like that, but most of us don't do that. So it's like my opportunity to look into somebody else's process and see if there were things I could borrow from it to improve my process. I was feeling kind of stuck and stale at that point. But it's not a work for hire. We're partners on these books. So we split everything 50-50. And yeah, so it's really been interesting. But I do the writing. We kind of work on the plotting together. I do the writing. They'll polish it up. And really, their responsibility is to sell the movie rights. That's what they excel at.
I was going to ask about that because it sounded like work for hire, but it didn't quite sound like work for hire because I checked the copyright and you were listed in the copyright. So
Yeah.
that was that's really cool. So now I was going to ask, is there any were there any restrictions on the way that you wrote that The Hunger? Was there like a you said that you plotted it with them. Was there any place where like you wanted to go a place and they were like, no, you can't go that route? Or
It was very collaborative. And now I'm currently working on our third book together. The one that won't come out until 2022, I think, because the spy novel comes out next year. Um, there's probably always creative, you know, differences. I mean, for one thing, is I've never written young adult. I've only written adult, so I vary adult sensibilities, you know, audience sensibilities when I think of a book and how the characters should be and what the complications should be and that sort of thing. And so we would tussle a little bit over that. And then the other thing is, historical facts. And that's a really interesting thing about writing historical fiction, especially something that's a reimagining. You know, there's a horror element in there. I think we can all agree that it's not going to be true to life. But still, you don't want to be like egregious. You don't want to like have them whipping out laptops or something, you know, as they're, pioneers on the trail. So sometimes there's a little disagreement over that because I'm the one who does all the research. And so, there's facts in my head that maybe I haven't really explained to them, let's say. But it's worked out really well, and I have learned a lot from working with them. They're great editors.
that's really cool. So was the Deep was a partnership as well?
It was.
Interesting, very cool. You wrote about the Donner Party and cannibals, and then your next book was uh, about the Titanic. What drew you to that topic next?
So, after The Hunger did fairly well, you start getting all these questions like, what other, horrendous historical event are you going to write about? And I suddenly felt like I was going to be the Irwin Allen of novels, just Poseidon Adventure and, Towering Inferno. And, what's bigger than the Titanic? But one day, and I'm not like a Titanic fan. I honestly, I didn't even watch the movie until after this deal was made. And that was just to make sure that I didn't like end up writing, some of the same tropes and everything. But my husband was watching a documentary on TV, and it was about the first dive to the Britannic, which is the sister ship, which also ended up sinking. And so when I heard that, I was like, well, that's really fascinating. I didn't even know there was a sister ship. And then, the uncanny, coincidence that it also sank. And then the guy said, and there was one woman who survived both sinkings. And I knew right there, I didn't even need to know what her story was. There is a story in this, right?
Yeah,
So
that's
that's how
awesome.
that came about. Yeah.
Oh wow, that's crazy cool.
You kind of have to as a writer, get yourself in the mindset so that you understand like what the elements of a great story would be so that when you stumble on it, and that may not be the exact story. So like The Deep is not the story of that woman, as a
Mhm.
matter of fact. I mean, she could have been, but I did use her history for some things, but because I had to change so much of her life. And she's a fairly well-known person now, Violet Jessup, that I didn't feel it was fair to project the more unsavory aspects of what the main character has to go through on this poor woman. So I had a completely fictional, main character. There's more fictional characters in The Deep than there were in The Hunger, for instance. And in the third book, it's all fictional characters. For writers, you need to be able to recognize when a good story falls in your lap, even if you're not going to write exactly that story. So, one of the things I do, and I think this has been very helpful for me, as I developed this course on developing conflict and drama in stories. And so you start to recognize what types of things will increase that drama and conflict. So then when you stumble across it in the wild, you're like, wow, it's got all the elements. Let's just build the story out, come up with great characters to, live in that story and go from there. And it's been very helpful.
That's so cool. I want to go back really quick, just because you mentioned that there was it sounded like a 20-year gap between you were writing in your 20s and then you started writing again in your 40s. What happened in that 20-year time? Was that your time in the NSA or?
Yes. So I actually have a 35-year career. When I started, which was a long time ago, they really didn't like you to have a life outside, right? They even if it wasn't associated with you being an intelligence. So, for instance, when I accepted the job, I was living in the Boston area, and one of the things I did, I was working part time as a music critic. And by the time I came down to Washington, I was writing columns for three small magazines. And I had to give all that up. And nothing to do. Nobody knew I worked for NSA. I'm talking about bands for Pete's sake. But they weren't comfortable with it. And so, I had just moved my whole life down there. Really, I had no intention of staying in the job. I just wanted the experience. What was it like? And I ended up retiring from it. But at the time, I thought, well, I've done this. I should, give it the good old college try. And if they're gonna, rather than quit and run off in a huff. And the columns were interesting, but my career wasn't going anywhere really.
Right.
Writing, as a music columnist, and so I gave it up and I stopped and I threw my all into my career. And it was a very satisfying career. I ended up working for NSA and for CIA
Oh,
and
cool.
doing
Wow.
all kinds of, yeah, crazy, amazing things. I left when I sold my first book because, again, they made it very uncomfortable. But then I ended up going back after a while and finishing out my career in
Wow.
the IC. Yeah. And so my
Um,
next book, the one that's coming out in the spring, is actually a spy novel. Who would have thought?
so on the subject of that, God, there's so many things that we could burrow into. But on the subject of your next novel, is it still called Red Widow? I saw that was the working
Yes, it is.
title. Is it
No,
is?
it's Red Widow. Yeah.
All right.
We'll be doing a cover reveal soon for it.
Cool. So what made you decide to pivot away from horror into to spy thrillers besides the fact that you have experience there?
So maybe it's just pride. I don't know. That 10 years that I was polishing up the taker over and over again, when you're in those MA programs, you get to meet with editors and agents, and they all said the same thing. With your background, why don't you write a spy novel? You got the platform; it would be wonderful. And I tried writing them, and they weren't good. I wrote several, and they just weren't good enough. And I was like, oh, forget it, So I was having lunch or breakfast, I forget which, with my current editor at Putnam, Sally Kim. This was a few years ago. And she said how she was really just so sad because The Americans, that TV show, was going into its last season. And then she looked at me and she said, I would love a book that combined a spy novel with, some of that sort of domestic aspects. What do you think? Well, when an editor says that to you, the only answer you can come up with is, yes, I can do that for you. So I said, give me a week and I'll get a proposal to you. And we spent a year honing the story before I ever wrote anything.
Wow.
But by the time she got, yeah, it was a really interesting experience because she just kept upping the ante until it was like in the nosebleed seats. But people who've read it have said, wow, this is the twistiest novel I've ever read. And so, yeah, and I'll just share with you, we are this close to signing a TV deal for it.
Oh, fingers crossed for
I
you. That's
know.
awesome.
Thank you. I know it's crazy. It is absolutely crazy.
So with the TV deal, do you think they'll be able to get Scarlett Johansson back to reprise her role?
Yeah, I don't know who they have in mind for it. We actually have two wonderful female leads in the book, so you double your chances.
Could you? I'm curious. I don't know if you can or not, but are you able to give like a little bit of like a premise of what the novel is, or?
I wish, I should have boned up on this before the call because I just gave the premise to this producer too, even though it's already off the table. And I did the worst job describing it. So I feel a little spooked right now. But it's basically kind of asks you, who can you trust? Like you think you can trust, the people you work with in the CIA, and you find out that you can't. I mean, that's not necessarily in a bad way, but what I tell people, and again, it's not that I hated my career there, I didn't, but it's not quite what people think it is. And one of the reasons is, the thing, CIA does a lot of things, right? But the thing that everybody thinks of it for is the clandestine service. Those are the people who go out and they recruit foreigners who have secrets that the United States needs, to protect our national security. So the people who recruit those spies, they're not spies themselves, the recruiters, are the best manipulators in the world. And you can do it the hard way or you can do it the easy way, right? But the thing is a lot of them can't turn it off. And so they manipulate their wives and they manipulate their husbands and their children. There's a higher incidence of alcoholism and divorce rates. And if you work there, you're frequently the victim of it too.
Right.
And you've got to learn to how do you handle these people? And so that's kind of at the heart of it. It's like people find themselves being manipulated, and there's a horrible, horrible crime at the center of the whole thing. But it ends up being these two women who are both work at the agency, kind of in this cat and mouse game, because one of them has done something and the other one, it's her job to figure out who did it. And they become friends by the time the woman figures out that the other one did it.
Sounds so good.
Well, thank you. I hope, and the thing that people have found interested who've read it, and this includes the TV people and everything, I mean, we had movie people and everything, is that it's two strong women, but neither of them is really a bad guy. Like, they're doing these really difficult things for the right reason, and that's what they liked. It kind of showed that when you're in this field, sometimes you just have to do really difficult things, and, anyway, and no one's going to thank you.
What did you say you did for your job? Did you say you worked for the NSA, or were you like, I'm an ice cream truck driver, or?
Ice cream truck driver. I never tried that one. So it's interesting because this makes a lot of people uncomfortable. So depending on which agency you work for, right? They have different missions. I don't know if you want a whole IC tutorial at this point. The intelligence community, there's 17 agencies that are part of it. 80% of the intelligence community belongs to the Defense Department, and they're what we call collectors, agencies that have the mandate to collect certain types of information. They're not what most people think of. They think of CIA and these smooth-tongued, spy recruiters and everything, right? 90% of the intelligence community is not like that. They're really honest, hardworking people who find it very hard to lie about what they do. So they often flub it. So most people in DC can guess if you work for the intelligence community because you get all like for a minute or something. By the time I got to CIA, I learned to finesse it a little bit better. But no, I can't tell you what I tell people.
You said you're working on another novel, and I assume it's at least somewhat of a historical bent. Is there a specific event that you're sort of building on top of, or is it more of an era? Or
It probably more of an era. I mean, there isn't a triggering event that maybe a lot of Americans aren't aware of. So the book, it's got a working title. It's called The Fervor, and it's set in World War II, and it has to do with the fire balloons that came over from Japan over the western part of the United States towards the end of the war. A lot of people don't know about it, but it's a fascinating history. I mean, and that's the same thing with all of these books. I find out that the history, all those little details, are so much just crazy fascinating, and that most people don't get exposed to it, right? Because history books and TV shows and stuff tend to gloss over that stuff. It's important to me because I'm Japanese American, and while my family wasn't interned because I'm a second generation, my mom was actually in Japan during the war. She was a teenager. But my husband's family were all interned. And don't ask me why, but for a while I worked with a bunch of people who were also Japanese American who had their families had a lot of internment experiences. So I knew not only the history of the internment camps, but I knew the emotional stories and how the Japanese Americans felt about, they were loyal Americans and they just basically were treated like not citizens, right?
yeah,
They were basically imprisoned for years by a government they thought they could trust with absolutely no evidence that they were spying for Japan or doing anything wrong, right? So one of the interesting things about the hunger and the deep, the things that I've learned and that my partners and we've all kind of gone along for this ride, the hunger is very much history based. But then when I look back at, a lot of people in the editorial house who were reading it before it came out said, this feels weirdly current. And now I wrote it during the 2016 presidential election. But then when I look back at what actually happened, the parallels just jump out at you. This was a group of people who kind of didn't know what they were getting into when they decided they were going to go across country. It was just sort of the thing to do. I know, as stupid as that sounds, right? But if you think about, there wasn't the kind of mass communication we have here.
yeah.
So while a lot of them did learn about it through newspapers, they were completely fake news, right? Like a lot of made up stories and stuff like that. So people just got in their wagons and decided they were going to go out west. And in this particular case, and with the Donner Party, they ended up following a man who had no reason to be the leader of the wagon train. He was not a leader. He didn't know anything about going across the wilderness. He just wanted to be the leader. And their fate was sealed because they listened to charlatans who, for political reasons. So the thing that really screwed the Donner Party was they did this thing called the Hastings Cutoff, which was supposed to take 700 miles off their trip. And it was just a made up thing, basically, that was pushed by this guy who wanted to go into politics and wanted to drive Americans to settle in California, which was a territory of Mexico at the time, because he thought if enough U.S. people settled there that the U.S. would have to get into a war with Mexico and make it part of the Union. So he wrote this propaganda book, basically, and he convinced a couple parties to try to use the Hastings Cutoff. And that's what killed him, because it was not passable, and it took them so long that by the time they got to the mountain pass, winter had come and they were socked in, and it killed half the wagon party. So yeah, there's kind of a few lessons. Like if you think about it, there's kind of a few lessons. So by the time I got to the deep, then I realized, let's look at the historical record, see what the main societal issues were at the time, because you'll see that reflected in the history, and then see if there's resonance for modern readers and see if we can build a story around it. And that absolutely worked here, because the two main societal issues at the time were women's rights and class inequality. Like that was the era where the term robber baron was coined, right?
Mhm.
And I don't know, a couple years ago when I was writing this book, somehow it just jumped out at me that, these weren't just purely academic issues anymore. So now let's fast forward to Japanese, this incredible, whipping the population against an innocent part of the American public, right, in order to further political gains. It just again seemed really,
Yeah,
really trenchant.
we don't know anything about keeping people in camps these days. Uh,
No, not at all. And lying to people, and yeah, wanting to, yeah. It's been really interesting to write. Again, it's triggered by the fire balloons, which were these balloons that Japan sent over, balloons with little timers, and that would release the cargo. And they were hoping to set fires in the United States, not because they thought they were going to burn down half the country. They kind of knew it was a lost cause at this point. It was more symbolic than anything else.
right.
And just a few of them made it, and it wasn't a huge threat or anything. But it's an interesting story. And then pairing that with what was going on in the internment camps, just the two of them together made a good story.
It's it's so cool.
Oh, thank
I
you. Thank
I
you.
love history so much. There's one of my favorite things is just the way that uh, seemingly random things in the past will somehow have some sort of undue influence through the ages up like into modern day.
It is very interesting. So my other life, I did intelligence work for a long time, but towards the end of my career, I ended up doing work in emerging technologies. Yeah, kind of crazy. But my first field is so in intelligence, though, was so technical that a lot of us who do that just end up having a affinity for technology. So one of the things we find, I do technology forecasting, and is that it's not really just the technology itself, but it's a confluence of events, and it's usually like a lot of societal events and
Mhm.
sometimes economic events that makes the breeding ground for technology to take off. And then that's the thing that goes viral and becomes the disruptor that changes everything, that life as we know it. Video teleconferencing, this is one of the things I brought up in the MIT panel. For years, the industry, I mean years, decades, I was using video teleconferencing in the intelligence community over 20 years ago, right? And for years the industry kept saying, oh, that's going to catch on, that video conferencing is going to catch on, right? And we all know it didn't really. Now, look, we can't live without it. It took a pandemic. No one predicted that it would take a pandemic to make us engage. But now, look at all the knock on effects, because it doesn't exist in a vacuum. Real estate is being decimated, right? Um, a lot of jobs. It's just having like all of these ripple on huge disruption effects. Who would have thought? So a lot of what I do now is not a lot, but what I do for the government and for companies, well, two things. One is helping them wrap their heads around what emerging technologies, what the future is going to look like. So that's what I was doing for MIT, is futurist work. Um, and the other thing just went right out of my, and analytic methodologies. I help companies figure, like especially analytics companies, new analytics companies, understand what their methodology is, how to improve it, where the holes are, that kind of
Sure.
stuff.
So, what is something that's making you happy lately? It can be anything: book, show, life circumstance, anything.
Living here, it's so beautiful. I mean, I happened to be building like this tiny little vacation house in the mountains of West Virginia when COVID struck. And now that I can just Zoom all my meetings, my husband and I decided, well, let's move out there. I mean, we are in the sticks. I lived in an okay place in Maryland, but it's, the whole DC area is so congested. It's just gotten crazy, just crazy. I mean, there were some days I wouldn't know if my commute would be 3 hours. Like if there were no traffic, it would be a 20-minute commute, but some days 3 hours.
Mm-hmm.
And while it was pretty and everything, it's not, this is like soul enriching. It's just so beautiful here and so nice. And the people are wonderful. I mean, but just, yeah, I'm so lucky. I just cannot believe, because I grew up in pretty modest circumstances. I never knew any, we never had it, knew anyone that had a vacation home. That was just insane. I was only the second person in my family to go to college and put myself through college and put myself through grad school. But yeah, I never thought that I would have this opportunity. I was a government employee. They can make pretty good money, but still, if it weren't for the books and the consulting work, this wouldn't have happened. But yeah,
That's
just so lucky.
that's so awesome. Yeah, I saw that you were sharing pictures of like the mountains, and it's just so beautiful. It's crazy.
It's
Uh,
crazy beautiful here. It really is. I didn't know it could be this beautiful.
so back to reading for a moment. What are some current genre trends that you find exciting?
Well, I do like the fact that horror seems to be allowed back into the literary fold. I mean, when I started writing, and that was back in 2000, 2001. um, my early books are very much compared to early Anne Rice, for instance. While it didn't have, horror tropes like vampires or werewolves or something, there was a lot of similar elements. And at that time, people would, agents or whatever, would read the pages and they were like, yeah, this is nice, but this is dying. I don't want to see another book like this. And horror sections were being closed down, in bookstores, and it just got a bad name. And so I honestly didn't expect it to have a revival in my lifetime. But so it's been kind of nice. I mean, not that I'm like my writing is like classic horror. I don't think it is, but that's part of what's exciting. It's kind of opening up. It's like a big tent. After The Hunger, I've been lucky enough to have a lot of books sent to me for blurbs and that sort of thing. And a lot of the ones that I've been getting are very close to psychological suspense, girl in peril stories. But there's just something about it that makes it, a little bit also in the horror camp.
Hmm.
And I think that's wonderful. Before those people would have like shied away from the horror label, but now they're embracing that too. So yeah, that's a great thing.
Yeah, I think I saw Chuck Wendig was talking about because his books he considers them horror, but they're usually not marketed as horror. And he was
Hmm.
talking about how horror didn't so much die as much as it just kind of went into hiding in other genres. So it was like, oh, it's a serial killer story. It's a psychological suspense. Is it monsters? It's like a dark fantasy. It's
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and if you think about it, there's so many slasher or serial killer movies. Movies are marketed as horror,
yep.
right? But why is that same story when you go to a bookstore on a different shelf?
It's wild.
Yeah.
Uh,
But more people seem to be willing to embrace it. And I do think this huge popularity of horror in films and TVs have had a lot to do with it, made it more acceptable.
I think so too. Yeah. My wife and I were talking about how when the movie Insidious came out, it was sort of the first like sort of balloon up of like testing out like how is horror, and now like I think that it sort of like got more and more solid, and then when Jordan Peele came out with Get Out, it was like everyone was like,
Yeah.
oh right, horror, I remember, I used to watch those as a kid.
And I do think the whole streaming phenomena has helped a lot because as more and more original content was needed, and they're trying to hit certain demographics, you just saw more and more horror stories, being turned into TV, and that kind of it's just been like a force multiplier. Yeah, it's really really wonderful. But I still run into people, usually older, that'll go, and women that'll say, "Oh, I just don't read horror," and I'm
Yep.
like, "Well, believe me, if you read this book, you'd probably like it, but I cannot force them to take the book and read it."
Yep. Speaking of, have you read Mexican Gothic?
I haven't read it yet. I read the beginning of it, but I'm kind of backed up with blurb books right
Oh,
now.
I bet. I can only imagine. Well, I actually I'm almost done with it. I'm really enjoying it. It reminds me. It kind of made me think about the Hunger, because not that they're necessarily the same genre, but you both have this sort of slow burn. You're both very like atmospheric, and I really like that about both of them. I'm a sucker for the slow burn movies, so I like to settle in
Excellent.
and like soak in the atmosphere.
Yeah. Which, yeah, that I have to say that's probably the one thing that I don't know. Doesn't upset me or something, but I just wish read some readers could be a little bit more open minded. Like occasionally you'll get people that are just like, well, how can that be horror? It's so slow paced. Well, I remember horror and it was slow paced, you know, and just, you know, so it's not your book. It still deserves to exist. You know, there should be books for every taste. And that's the amazing thing, like how, you know, so many different nuances of taste out there, right? You can pretty much find a book for any taste, which is a good thing.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you so much for sitting down and talking with me. You're such a great person. Like it's so fun to like talk
Oh,
with you that like it's been a great
well, this
interview. I
was a
really
lot of
appreciate it.
fun. I had a lot of fun talking with you, so thank you very much.
Sure. Thank